Omicron has set the world into a spin. The US President Joe Biden says the only way nations can beat the new strain and others to come is if the world is fully vaccinated. Joining me live now is Donald Trump's former Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. Thanks so much for your time. Great to see you once again. How has the US reacted? You seem to see, some countries putting in a proportionate response and others completely panicking.
Yeah, Lauren, thanks for having me. I don't think it's panic. We had a little jitters, I guess, on Friday, both in Washington and on Wall Street, but you saw things sort of calm down over the weekend. The president addressed the nation midday here today. It's about 7 o'clock, 6:30 here at night. He addressed the nation midday and took a very even-handed approach, recognized the fact that we do have the new variant. There are concerns about its transmissibility, but there's still a good bit of information that is not available to us. I think we're hearing now could be between 2 and 6 weeks before we have a real understanding as to whether or not this variant is actually more deadly, just as deadly, less deadly than Delta or some of the previous variants. So while there was a sort of a hiccup on Friday, things do seem to have calmed down over the weekend. Certainly that was reflected in the markets today and also reflected in some of the language coming out of Washington. So while the media hype here is still fairly high, I don't think panic is anywhere near the way to describe what we're experiencing here in the U.S.
Yeah, media hype is one thing. How the rest of the population do take in this information after 2 years is another. People fatigued? Is compliance waning? What's happening with vaccine hesitancy in the US?
Yeah, keep in mind that compliance here varies state from state, or it could also vary depending on what you're doing. If you're on an airplane, for example, that's not covered by the state governments, it's covered by the federal government. And compliance sort of depends on where you are. Generally speaking, compliance here is fairly high. If you fly on an airplane, compliance is 100%. If you're in an airport, it's nearly 100%. I'm certain there's pockets of places that are not as compliant as others, but generally speaking, people have sort of gotten used to it. In my state, for example, in South Carolina, there are no mask requirements at all. Businesses can require them, but the state government does not. There is still pushback against the vaccine here in pockets, but you're not seeing the type of wholesale protests and so forth. You're seeing mostly folks who are protesting, they will protest it through work. You have groups of employees at various employers saying, we don't want to get the vaccine. Go ahead and fire us if you want to, but you can't replace us at this time. So there's still pushback for sure. Compliance, vaccination rates are still fairly high. I think it's above 80% for at least 2 jabs at this point, or excuse me, at least for 1 jab. But generally speaking, you're not seeing the type of violence here that you might be seeing in other places around the world.
What about the US and its leadership role in all of this? We've seen this new variant out of Africa, essentially because they have a really low vaccination rate. What does this say about Western nations, mostly the US, but other countries like Australia, about the need to vaccinate poorer nations?
Yeah, I think that one thing that all the nations learned as they tried to roll out their vaccinations is that it's hard to do, and you need a certain infrastructure, not roads and bridges, but sort of methods to deliver healthcare. We struggled with that in the outset of the United States, given the fact that developed Western nations and some of the more autocratic Asian nations like China struggled to get the vaccine out. It's probably not surprising that some of the more underdeveloped nations are struggling. So today, for example, on television here, various of the pharmaceutical company CEOs were on TV touting the fact that they actually had more vaccine that they could pump out into the system. So yeah, can the Western nations do more to get vaccines to some of the countries like South Africa? Yes. But at the same time, it's that last mile, as we say in this country, that the last application of the vaccine that's often the bottleneck, and it's going to continue to be a challenge because the infrastructure just doesn't exist in many of these, especially African nations, to get the vaccines where they need to be. But I think everybody can do better to try and get the vaccines out into the population.
To be cynical about this, isn't this an opportunity as well for the US and its allies to maybe reassert that influence that we have lost in some of these emerging nations? We're competing with China, essentially. Is there a risk that China might fill that void?
Well, sure. I mean, voids always get filled. There's no question about that. I think the Western nations, especially the U.S., have done a pretty good job so far
Yeah.
on the work on the vaccine. That the efforts of the previous administration, the Project Warp Speed, which everyone seems now to acknowledge did help get many vaccines to market quicker, is something that the United States can and should take credit for. But you're right. Listen, it sometimes out of sight is out of mind, and much of the world to us is out of mind. When you watch the news here at night, you don't get news from overseas, generally speaking. I've been watching your show now for the last 20 minutes, and several of the stories have been things that are happening outside of Australia. We don't get that here for the most part. Most of our news is domestic, and out of sight is out of mind. So there's really not much motivation politically to do things in other parts of the world because it doesn't tend to get people reelected here.
I'm glad you can get around that geo block there. It's good to know.